Welcome to Informed Choice Radio. I'm delighted to welcome back two previous guests. So we've got Brian Portnoy and we've got Neil Bage, and they are working together now on a very exciting new venture that we're going to be talking about today. And when I received the email about a week ago about this new venture, I thought, great excuse to ask them to come back onto the podcast and we can get into a discussion hopefully about what they're doing, but also about all aspects of behavioral finance, which is their baby really. So for listeners who didn't hear those previous conversations, perhaps I can ask both of you to start with some brief introductions, remind us who you are. Brian, do you want to go first as you've traveled the furthest for this conversation?
Yeah, sure. Traveled to my basement office yet again. Yeah, so hi everyone. I'm Brian Portnoy. Been in the finance and investment business for more than 20 years. Passion is for behavioral finance, decision making, psychology of money. I've written a few books in the field, and of late, and we'll get into it obviously, started my own company called Shaping Wealth, which is all about the practical application of all of the great ideas from behavioral science toward the world of money, and found this other guy to be my partner in crime.
Absolutely. And partner in crime, Neil, if you'd like to sort of share your introduction as well and tell us who you are.
Yeah, so Neil Bage, I was previously the founder of a fintech company, a behavioral finance fintech company called BIQ. And I was there for 7 years, developing that from an idea into a product that resulted in an app in the App Store and an entire analytics dashboard for advisors to use. I've always had a lifelong passion with how the human brain works, and more to the point, how our brain, our psychology impacts our physiology. So how our body reacts to how we think. On my journey in behavioral science, I've met some incredible people, some very bright people, some very lovely people. And I am very fortunate that Brian falls into that category and asked me
I
to
was
come
going to
and
say that
join
was the
him.
other. I've met
Yeah, then this other.
bright, good-looking, successful, and then I met
Yeah,
Brian.
and then I met Brian, and I thought, well, if you can't have one, have the other.
Yeah.
And then Brian asked me to go on this journey with him, and yeah, here we are.
Fantastic. Now, this journey, this project is shaping wealth, and I understand the goal of it is to achieve something called funded contentment. So that might be a good place for us to start. Brian, what is funded contentment when it's at home?
Yeah, that's my shorthand for true wealth. So the Geometry of Wealth, which I published about 3 years ago, and you and I chatted about at the time of publication. I've been super lucky. Like the book's received it's had a very warm reception, and in particular, this idea that being rich and being wealthy are two very different experiences, life experiences, seems to have landed with audiences, different types of people all over the world. Being rich is the quest for more. The quest for more is genetically wired into us, but at the same time, ultimately unsatisfying. It's the stone of Sisyphus. You push and you push and you push, and you do it, and next thing you know, you're at the bottom of the mountain with a rock on your head, and you do it again. Being wealthy, to me, is a very different mindset, which is basically the ability to underwrite a life that's meaningful to you. Like I mentioned, I spent most of my life in finance, focused on the numbers, the quantitative stuff. And the older I get, the more I realize that it's more about the mindset and the stories and less about the numbers. And so funded contentment is just my shorthand for true wealth, which is the ability to underwrite a meaningful life.
No, that's a great explanation of it. I correct me if I'm wrong, but I get the impression that this experience we've had of the pandemic has actually been quite useful for a lot of people in making that distinction between being rich and being wealthy. Is that something you've seen?
Oh, 100%. And I know Neil has seen it in the UK. I've certainly seen it in the US. I was listening to a podcast a couple of days ago, and the people on it was very interesting. They were talking about the take this job and shove it economy. Uh, Basically, a year being forced to different, work differently. I think it's going to go down as one of the greatest social experiments in modern humanity. And I think what it revealed to a lot of people is that, or forced them to come to terms with the fact that they don't like their job, or they don't like the way that they go about doing their work, that they like their family more than they thought, they don't like their family as much as they'd hoped. We've been forced to, consider a lot of things that otherwise would have been impossible by the mere fact that we effectively weren't allowed to leave our homes for a year. Not that we could have timed this, and it's always awkward and uncomfortable to talk about the good timing related to the pandemic. But I think the message that Neil and I and our other partners have with regard to funded contentment couldn't be better timed as people reconsider where money fits into their lives, where work fits into their lives.
Yeah. And Neil, that's been your experience too, has it, when you've been observing people's behaviour recently?
Yeah, it has, and I've been working with a lot of advisors where they've allowed me into the homes of their clients through the medium of Zoom, and lots of the conversations are about people hitting reset. Actually using this time, which has been a long period of time, to kind of reflect and do some proper inner soul searching about what makes them happy. And of course, this is kind of like an existential crisis that we've been through, right? At the end of your garden path, there is, and I don't mean to bring the whole podcast down, but at the end of your garden path is death. We're seeing it every day on the news, people dying around us, and it gives us a sense of, it gives us a reality check. And that's not just about the way we go about our lives, but also had the fragility of life too. And then people properly reflect and think, well, actually, you know what, if this could all be taken away from me, do I really want to leave this earth doing a job I hate and striving for more and never achieving happiness? So I think it's given time people to really properly reflect. And Brian's right, the timing is never going to be ideal with a global pandemic. But the reality is, and I'm speaking personally here, I've had a huge amount of time to reflect on what makes me happy, what makes me content. And it's made me completely shift my career path, but equally some of the more personal things in my life that I don't think I would ever have gotten the time to sit and reflect deep enough to affect those changes.
Are you happy to share a bit more? I know this is personal, but what sort of realizations have you had?
Well, so it was probably a third of the way into the pandemic. I was coming down to my desk every day working. I was a BIQ at the time, and don't forget that was my baby, right? So this was the thing that I was in my head. We brought to life, and we went out and we started selling it, and I started forging relationships with people, but something wasn't right. And one day I sat at my desk and I just thought, I'm not happy. There's something inside of me that just it's not making me happy. And I didn't know what that was. So I decided to practice what I preach, and I decided to do a proper moment of self-reflection. I got a piece of paper and I wrote down one side, things I'm good at, things I'm not good at. And along the bottom, what I enjoy doing, what I hate doing. And I looked at the what I hate doing and what I'm not good at box and realized that I was spending far too much time there. And I looked at the what do I love doing and what am I good at, and I was hardly spending any time there. So I thought, well, this is just the natural progression, I guess, of an entrepreneurial business, that I've moved from the phase of doing everything I love into a much more operational management role that actually I don't like doing. So I decided there and then I need to change this, else I'll never be happy. And I did. So I spoke to my previous colleagues and said, I need to move on. They were very supportive. And within 4 weeks, I was out of BIQ, sitting thinking, what do I want to do? And I know I love this engaging with people. I know I love educating people. I know I love talking about behaviors to people. And then there was a metaphorical knock on the door from Mr. Portnoy, who said, look, we've known each other for a while. We're both on the same journey, really. Why don't we just pull together and do this together? And it was a moment of just instant relief for me to find someone who believes in the vision I have, but equally we're striving for a bigger goal here, to use our experiences of not only behavioral finance, but the lives we've had personally to try and make other people kind of see the light of day and be happier themselves.
I think it's a fairly common experience, certainly from the conversations I've been having over the past sort of 18 months or so. Lots of people have had these light bulb moments, these epiphanies, and things have switched on and made them think a bit deeper and a bit longer term. Brian, do you think there's, and going back to Neil's earlier point about, we're thinking about death, we're thinking about the end of the road a lot more. Do you think there's also a risk from a behavioural perspective that people might start thinking, well, we're going to die, there's a pandemic, just live for the moment and screw the future, don't worry about the long term. And we know when people take that very sort of fatalistic attitude, they don't tend to build wealth, do they? They tend to go out and blow it all and
Right.
live for the moment.
Well, there's always impetuousness in human behavior. I mean, we are, time travelers of a sort, albeit with imperfect mechanics. So, the human mind is always shifting between three modes. There's the future, there's the past, and there's the present. So we have prospection, retrospection, introspection. And actually, a lot of the psychology of money that Neil and I focus on and we work with clients on, one of the really deep issues, so deep that you don't get into it much of the time, is that this human experience of temporality is so unique compared to other species. It produces a whole set of choices that we make or don't, perverse incentives that we come to terms with or don't. There will probably be, some indulgence, some sort of extra hedonism on the margins. Here in the US, things are more or less open. I was at a bar the other night and it was shoulder to shoulder. It was almost, it was uncomfortable, but like, okay, we're back. And I think we're going to get back to some of the traditional or classic challenges with, present bias, people living very much in the now and not thinking about the future. But with the big asterisk that I think we all deserve a little bit of a break. I think things were put on hold in such an artificial way that all we could do was think about the future. Like, when is this going to be over? That I wouldn't be surprised if there's sort of a correction to the other side. And then we'll get back to sort of just normal human pathologies. But I think in the near term, at least from what I'm seeing in the US, I think people are going to go a little bit bonkers for a while.
Yeah, we do hear about the sort of the next roaring 20s, don't we? As almost a release valve, all this pent up energy for spending and for hedonism and just enjoyment.
Yeah.
One of the things that I worry about slightly, I don't spend too much time worrying about this, but I do worry about it slightly, is that we won't take all the lessons that we've learned from this pandemic, that we will revert a bit too much to normal. And is that a behavioural thing that humans don't learn from the past, that they that they sort of they experience a quite teachable moment, but actually it's quite short lived in terms of their application of behaviour?
I mean, I know your thoughts on this, but my it's very hard to generalize about the way people are going to learn from this. I will say it is such a remarkably unique experience. It is such a strange experiment in sort of human living and human nature. I think it is going to make its mark on people. I mean, if you look at some of the labor force data in the US, it's clear that from the level at which people are quitting jobs or not wanting to go back to work and reconsidering what their vocation is, at least in the near to medium term, I think, I don't know if I'd phrase it in terms of lessons learned, but I would phrase it in terms of reconsideration of possibilities. And I have to say, like, the way that we, Neil and I, our colleagues, are working with financial advice firms, corporate wellness programs, is that often what's lacking in all of this is the words and the narrative and the story and the arc to, well, what is possible. And we're finding just a lot of success with groups of people where we can open the door to conversations that they probably didn't want to have a year or 3 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. So a greater willingness to engage in these big conversations and think differently in that sense. Something you mentioned there, Brian, which is about workforce, labour force attitudes, and something Neil and I are experiencing here in the UK at the moment is a real struggle. Lots of businesses simply cannot find the staff. We're seeing rising vacancy rates. I do wonder. I came across this term today for the first time, the Great Resignation, which apparently is a prediction. There's up to 30% of the workforce in the States apparently are planning on poised to resign from their roles because of what they've discovered in this pandemic. And I do wonder, and Neil, if you've got any views on sort of what people's changing workforce attitudes, for example, wanting to work from home, work remotely, not wanting to work 5 days a week anymore, etc., what that might mean for wealth and wealth building.
I think so. Actually, let me just jump back, if I can, Martin, to what Brian just said about the change in people and lessons learned. I echo his comments that this moment in history is a unique moment in all of our lives, in every living person's life. But there's a difference, right? This isn't just a temporary week-long thing. This has been a year and a half. It'll be 2 years in probably end to end by the time we get back to any level of normality. And our colleague Joy Leary says, uses a beautiful phrase, we've experienced a collective trauma as a planet. It's been a trauma, and trauma leaves its mark. And some people will experience symptoms like PTSD as they come out of this. Some people will just go gung-ho and become very risk-seeking in their behavior to compensate for having to be cautious in the past. So I don't think there's an answer to, will we take the lessons learned? I think, however, they will be lessons that will manifest themselves later down the line as we come to terms with the trauma that we've all been through. And I think that links into your second question, which is, I think people have realized that we've been through a collective trauma and think, you know what, this is a proper wake-up call for me. If I can live on 70% of my income, and I don't need to travel, and I'm sitting at breakfast every morning with my kids, and I'm sitting at the dinner table every evening with my kids and my partner, and we're having dinner together, and we're having valuable family time, and I can see my kids growing up instead of getting the 5 a.m. train into London and then the 7 p.m. train out of London and never seeing my kids. There's a premium on that. And I think that the pandemic has made people realize what that premium is. Or, they might not be able to quantify pounds and pence, dollars and cents, but they've realized that there is a premium to be had. So I think people are going, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to work 4 days a week, 3 days a week, or I'm going to work a day in the office and 4 days at home. And any employer, I think, that's worth their salt going forward will allow that to come to fruition, because ultimately allowing that is a core part of the funded contentment story.
Right. Yeah, and I know one of the delivery mechanisms you have for this project is via employer wellness projects. It's via the workforce as well as obviously via advisors who have a route to the consumer market. So what role do employers have when it comes to funded contentment? How do they facilitate that happening? Brian, perhaps you could answer that.
Yeah, well, I'd step back and say that there's been a pretty important trend over the last 10, 15 years. Maybe it accelerated after the GFC in 08 and 09, where, and this is an American perspective, with people putting so much time and effort into their jobs that the workplace, and we don't even have to assign a charitable motive. We could just say, hey, we want to create something very attractive so that we can, get better people here. There's programming along multiple dimensions for employees, and so we could just generally say that the corporate wellness area has exploded over the last decade. Physical wellness in terms of gym memberships, in terms of nicer chairs, flexible work time, mental wellness in terms of access to counseling services and and other resources. And increasingly, we see financial wellness, which is this vague term, but in many cases, it's okay. You're gonna contribute to your pension or your 401k here in the U.S. And what's the right way to do that? So in a narrow sense, investment education, but that's been broadening to a bigger sense of financial well-being. Like what we talk about, where does money fit into a meaningful life? I think somewhat ironically, or at least surprisingly, the corporate wellness space is further ahead than the wealth management industry in tackling some of these financial well-being issues. So what we aim to do, and what I think we have, is some original content, some original delivery methods for corporates who want their teams to have access to these resources, to these tools and stories and such. And from what we've seen so far, and it's very, very early days because we're focused more on the wealth management side than the corporate side to start. But in these very early days, it's clear that when you talk to senior executives at small, medium, and big companies, any programming where they say, for a few bucks or for a few pounds, I can give a really nice benefit to my people, and they're going to be the better for it. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, no, unsurprisingly, it's beneficial for both the employee and the employer. Then, are people happy to bring their personal wealth planning into the workplace and maybe discuss it with colleagues? I'm not sure what the delivery mechanisms look like in this sense, but is that sometimes a bit of an uncomfortable conversation to bring home finance into the workplace?
Yeah, I think one of the things that Neil and Joy, our other content partner, and I, is that I think we're very good at making people feel constructively uncomfortable. When you open the door to funded contentment, all of a sudden you open the door to asking people, how would you define a meaningful life? To which a lot of people say, well, they could start off by saying, who the hell do you think you are? None of your damn business. But one thing I've seen, having given hundreds of speeches all over the world, Neil's given hundreds of speeches all over the world, by thousands of speeches, is that giving regular folks, the three of us, our partners, our parents, our friends, our neighbors, giving them permission to talk about money is such a powerful moment. It still blows me away. Like, there's almost no learning curve for me. Like, every time we talk to a group and you give the group, whether it's 2 people or 2,000 people, permission to say, hey, this is really real. People don't talk about money because it touches on such nerves of fear and greed and envy and joy and hope and all these other things, but it's okay. Number one, the brain's wired to make crappy decisions about all of this. So you're not broken, you're normal. And number two, you share this normality with everybody else, and everybody isn't talking about the same thing all at the same time. So let's be constructively uncomfortable. Open the door to this. I mean, we haven't figured it out yet. I mean, we're relatively brand new, but we know from the careers that got all of us here that that's a pretty cool moment for a lot of people, where they can say, if not out loud, at least to themselves, I'm allowed to talk about this. Wow. Exhale, shoulders fall, people calm down. It's kind of awesome.
Yeah, and I've seen it in practice, in action, in the financial planning meeting room setting with clients, and giving people that permission to almost break out from their everyday thinking when it comes to this stuff, and think I don't have to follow a set path that I was conditioned to follow my whole life. I can actually think beyond that, think bigger. It's
Well, especially in the financial planning industry, it's theater to a large extent. The advisor is playing a part, effectively reading from the script of what they're supposed to be doing in terms of economics and markets and investing and all this kind of stuff. And the client, who frankly doesn't know or care about any of that, feels that he or she needs to like play the part of someone who cares, but they don't know. And so the real conversation that could happen is usually not happening. And folks like you who get it, you're already doing it, but it's been a slow train coming in terms of uh, um, creating the opportunity for these conversations to take place. And in some ways, all our content is doing, all of our teaching tools are doing, is just giving people a little bit of a gentle and friendly push to say, hey, it's okay, you can go there, and here's some of the things you can talk about.
Yeah. So something that leapt out at me from your website when I was looking through it before this call was Seth Godin's definition of the difference between learning and education, and that one appealed to me. Firstly, because my wife is a primary school teacher, and secondly, because I have this lovely title at Informed Choice, our business, which is head of client education. So Neil, perhaps what the difference between learning and education, and where does Shaping Wealth come into this? It is a learning platform.
It is, and I mean, I personally, I always think that education it's a loaded word, right? So if we say to people, clients, I'm going to take you on an education, I think people can push back on that. It's a semantics thing, right? Whereas learning is just this ever evolving process. We're always learning. We go through life. We are always learning. And that's experiential. That could be me sitting down and reading a book. It could be me just going through a pandemic and having the time to sit and reflect. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring those moments of learning more to the fore to make people aware of them. Going back to something Brian was just saying about conversations around money, that learning process could be as easy as saying to a client, it's okay to not be okay. Full stop. That moment is a learning moment for the client. It doesn't need to be, in inverted commas, an education process. It's a moment of learning. And what we're trying to do is capture those little moments or create those moments where advisors and clients can learn. And if they can learn and they can adapt those learnings to their life, then they can go on that journey of thriving. Then they can sit and realize what makes me happy, what makes me content. And so it's a semantics play, I guess, but actually it's a really important one. I don't know that Brian, you want to add to that?
No, I think that's correct. We want people who are actively engaged in thinking about the lives they want to lead, about growth, genuine and authentic growth. We're not out to convince people to think about things they don't care about. It's a big world. And the thing about learning versus education, yes, a little bit semantic, but also real in the sense that we want people who are making an investment, small I investment in themselves, in their clients, to get to a better place, whatever that means to them, as opposed to traditional pedagogy where we're going to say, hey, here's how the stock market works, or this is the right way to budget. I mean, we could do that stuff in our sleep, but we're not going to, asleep or awake, because it tends to fall on deaf ears.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Gentlemen, it's been lovely to catch up with you both and have you back on the podcast today. Before I let you go, how can we find out more about Shaping Wealth? What shape does Shaping Wealth take? How people are going to be able to access it? What can they expect from it?
Yeah, so shapingwealth.com is the website, very easy to find. We're both very active in the financial Twitter community. So I'm at Brian Portnoy, Neil's at Neil Bage. And if anybody has any questions or inquiries, they can certainly reach us either through the site or our Twitter accounts or something like that. And for the time being, we're heads down building the business. We've got some opening clients, or some pilot groups that have all over the world that have agreed to pilot some of our ideas and technology. And at some point, I don't know if it's in 6 or 12 months, we're going to sort of open up a much bigger platform. But for now, it's kind of just heads down and grind out some good work.
Wonderful. Thank you for your time. It's been great to hear about it, and I wish you both every success with the project over the next year, longer, much longer, and I hope it goes really well. But thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. Thank you.